Good evening. Welcome to the October 16th, 2018 Planning Commission for the City of San Bruno. Roll call, please.
Chair Chase.
Here.
Vice Chair Biasotti.
Here.
Commissioner Johnson. Commissioner Legacy.
Here.
Commissioner Lethen.
Here.
And Commissioner Mason.
Here.
Great. Commissioner Biasotti, would you lead us in the pledge, please?
Of course. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America,
and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible,
liberty and
with
justice
liberty
for all.
and justice for all.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is approval of minutes, of which we have none. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. Communications?
There are no communications today.
Okay. Next item would be public comment on items not on the agenda. Is anybody here from the public wishing to speak on anything that's not on the agenda? No? Okay. Well, open and close that. Any conflicts of interest for any of the commissioners? No? Okay, that's good. So, moving right along. Item number 5, Bay Hill Specific Plan Project Team Introduction and Process Overview. This is a request for a use permit to allow. Oh, did I blow up? Oh, that's right. Sorry, jumped the gun a bit. Okay. If we can have a presentation, that'd be great.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, Commission. Javon Grogan, City Manager for the City of San Bruno. So I started October 30th. I stopped counting the number of days, but just a couple months on the job. One of the things I've made a point to doing is going around to a lot of our boards and commissions, and so I'm really here in 2 capacities tonight. First, just to say hi and kind of formally meet each of you. The other is to give you an update on the Bay Hill specific planning process and introduce our team. And so I'll begin by saying I think you all know that on October 30th we'll have a joint meeting of both the Planning Commission and the City Council to talk about the Bay Hill specific plan. And we'll go into a little bit details of what will happen at that meeting in just a little bit. But first, I want to introduce our project team. But I'll start by mentioning for the public that something you all know, which is our prior community development director, David Wolterine, retired as of August 24th. And so I found out about his retirement actually just before starting here in San Bruno. And one of the things that we did my first week was get out the recruitment for his successor. But knowing how long it takes to recruit really any executive position, but especially a community development director position, one of the things that I decided, in addition to getting his recruitment out, was that we needed to bring in an interim and have someone run the department while that recruitment process was happening. But the other thing we really needed to do was to continue to make progress on the Bay Hill specific plan. So soon after, I decided to bring in an interim project manager really to keep progress on the Bay Hill specific plan. Really what I didn't want to happen was for whatever interim we found for the community development department to potentially be there for 3, 4, 6 months while the recruitment was happening, and then have the new director need to come up to speed, and so we've lost a little bit of ground in the Bay Hill specific plan during that transition process. So we looked for a person, or in this instance a team, that could really provide project management services for the Bay Hill specific plan. And we were fortunate enough, I think, to find 2 very qualified individuals. One of those individuals, her name is Elaine Costello. She's the former community development director in Mountain View. She's the former community development director in South San Francisco, and I believe she worked for Belmont early on in her career. Very familiar with specific plans, very familiar with tech expansion. Currently works for a firm called Management Partners. So she came on board to help us with project management. And in addition, her colleague, Dan Marks, who's here tonight, who's a special advisor with Management Partners, also of his own right, a very nice resume, being the former community development director in Fremont and the former planning director in Berkeley. And so both Elaine and Dan have really been helping us since David Wolterine's retirement on August 24th, having a number of meetings with both YouTube, our staff, the various consultants working on the project, and really hit the ground running. And so I'm proud to say that we really didn't lose much ground at all, and we're tuning up the schedule, and we have continued with making progress on the specific plan. And the very next phase of that progress will be the October 30th joint meeting of the City Council and Planning Commission. So I'll ask David to come, Dan Marks, I'm sorry, to come up and give us an update on that. And the other side announcement that I'll also announce is that we have extended a conditional offer to a new community development director. And so that recruitment appears to have been successful. And while I can't announce the name tonight, we are very much down the line of hiring for that position. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dan.
Thanks, Javon. Thanks, Javon. It's on. Okay, good. Mr. Chair, and members of the Commission, again, my name is Dan Marks. I'm a special advisor with Management Partners. Management Partners is a management consulting firm for local government. We only work for local government. We provide a range of services to local government, and in this instance, clearly, we're providing them some assistance in regards to a specific plan, helping to manage a specific plan as Javon has laid out. I'm going to give a little background as to how we got here, where we are, and where we're going. You're going to get a lot more of this for the October 30th meeting, clearly, but he asked that I do a quick introduction of that. Most of you are familiar with the Bay Hill specific plan, but for the audience and for others, maybe I'll do a little bit more background than I might normally do for a planning commission that's been as engaged as you have been on this project. As you know, YouTube approached the city about 2 years ago with a significant expansion plan for the area in Bay Hill Office Park. That expansion plan was well in excess of what the city's current zoning would allow on that site. The city concluded that the best way to address YouTube's interests was to prepare a specific plan, a plan that would provide clear guidance to them and to other people in the Bay Hill specific plan as to the city's intent, interests, and concerns about what kind of land use they would like to see there and what they'd like to see YouTube do as part of their expansion plans. The process kicked off in May of 2017 with the selection of a team of consultants led by the firm of Diet and Baccia. And I think, again, some of you have worked with Diet and Baccia or heard from them over the course since they were brought on board, over a year ago, almost a year and a half ago. The process has been ongoing since then with community meetings, several reports, draft alternatives, a whole range of products which is available on the city's website and the planning department website. As the city manager has said, there's been a change in leadership in the city, and he brought us on board. As he said, I'm a former community development director, actually at the city of Berkeley. I was a planning director in Fremont. Got that reversed, it's okay. And Elaine, of course, as was noted, is the former community development director for the city of Mountain View. Between the two of us, we have prepared, I don't know how many specific plans. Clearly, Elaine has more experience in working with high-tech firms, having come from Mountain View, but I had some significant experience when I was in Fremont working with tech firms. Not so much experience working in Berkeley, working with tech firms, but a lot in Fremont. So we both have worked with the people that you're working with with the YouTube organization, and actually the Google organization, as I'm sure you know, which actually owns YouTube. Javon asked that we kind of give you a preview of what we're going to be doing on October 30th. When you'll be having a joint meeting with the City Council. There'll be, as I said a minute ago, we'll have a lot more detailed information for that meeting that'll be coming from the consultants, as well as from staff. At that meeting, we will be asking the Planning Commission to provide your input to the City Council on several key decisions that need to be made prior to preparing the specific plan and the EIR. Those decisions will help shape what we refer to as the preferred alternative. That is what will be evaluated in the EIR. There's many decisions that have to be made in terms of land, in terms of direction to us on land use, on roads, on a whole variety of things. You've seen the alternatives, I think most of you have seen some of the alternatives. We'll be talking about those alternatives and walking through them on October 30th to get direction and your advice to the City Council on that direction. It's called the preferred alternative, but I will note for the record that the final specific plan is very likely to be very different from that preferred alternative. Things change over time. There's community input through the course of preparing the specific plan. The EIR will provide the City Council and you with a great deal of information about the impacts of the project, and that tends to reshape the project as we go forward. But it's called the preferred alternative only in the context of the specific plan and as we begin to prepare a first draft of a specific plan. We hope that the Council will provide direction on all those issues on December 10th. We then take that direction, whether it's given on December 10th or shortly thereafter, and we go back and we prepare the specific plan, a draft specific plan, and begin to prepare a draft EIR. That takes about 6 months. From the time we get direction to the time we have a draft EIR and a draft specific plan is about a 6-month process. After the 6-month process, and when the DEIR comes up, we'll then enter a whole new process of refining the specific plan. As we get input from the community and from others. We'll also prepare between the draft EIR, which has to be available to the public for 45 days minimum, and the time we prepare an FEIR. So now we're looking at, if we get it done in June, we're looking at July, August, before we're ready to come back to the City Council and back to you to talk more about the specific plan and prepare a final EIR. At the end of the day, we will have a specific plan, we hope, and a final EIR by sometime late fall, early to late, sometime in the fall, I should say. I'm not sure exactly when that'll be. We're looking at probably October, maybe even November, by the time we will be concluded with this project, pretty much about a year from now. That's our current schedule, and that's what we're shooting for. We have a long road ahead, and so just wanted to lay this out for you so you get a sense of where we're going, and I'm happy to take any questions that you've got.
Thank you. Do the commissioners have any questions? No? Is it right to open it up to the public to see if... Oh,
To the chair.
I should have known, certainly. Commissioner Mason.
In regards to the plans that we're going to see, are they the same plans that we've already seen, or are they going to be a different iteration?
No, they're pretty much the alternatives you've already seen.
Okay, so that's what's going to be discussed on the 30th?
Correct, pretty much. And with a set of questions that will walk you through about those plans.
Okay, and then another question I had was at the public event that I went to, there was a discrepancy on the facts that were on the actual posters. For example, the number of employees that were expected to, work at YouTube over the years.
Mm-hmm.
There seemed to be a discrepancy from the answers I was getting from staff versus YouTube. So are those numbers, could those be worked out prior to the October 30th meeting?
I certainly hope so.
Okay, thank you. And that's all for me. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions from the commissioners? No? So I just asked the city attorney, should I open this up for public comment? Yes. Okay. Anybody from the public wishing to ask any questions, please feel free to do so. Come to the podium. No? Okay. Open and close. Thank you very much. Now, next item will be 115 Cypress Avenue. And this is a request for use permit. Application, use permit number 020-411-090. Staff report, please.
Good evening, everyone. The applicant is proposing to construct a 756 square feet of one-story addition at the rear of an existing single-family dwelling. The subject property is located on 115 Cypress Avenue on the west side of the street between Santa Lucia Avenue and San Felipe Avenue. The subject lot measures 4,500 square feet in area. The property is currently developed with a single-story, single-family home consisting of 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, living room, dining room, and a small kitchen in an 894 square feet of an attached to 25 square feet one-car garage. The proposed 756 square feet addition would result in 3 bedrooms, living room, family room, kitchen, 2.5 bathroom, and a home consisting of 1641 square feet of living space and a 235 square foot one-car garage. The purpose of use permit requirement is because it would be expanding 50% of the existing square footage of the home. The proposed addition would be located at the rear of the existing house, thus locating the massing away from the front of the house. Regarding the elevations, there are minor changes to the front elevation, and the most of the addition is in the rear of the property. The form of the roof would match with the existing house, and also the finishes would match with the existing house, which are hardy trim and shingle siding. The project is categorically exempt from SEQA. There were 300 feet notices sent out prior to the staff report being prepared, and staff received a phone call, a public comment through a phone call, which requested for general information about the size of the garage and why the project was not required to have a two-car garage. And staff explained that the applicant did not meet the 1825 threshold that requires a two-car garage. Apart from that, the project was reviewed at the Architecture Review Committee at the September 13th meeting, and the ARC forwarded the project to a Planning Commission as proposed. Though the new addition increases the floor area by more than 50%, it does not appear out of scale as it is in the rear. And furthermore, the location of the development protects the scale of the building as viewed from the front as well. Thus, staff recommends that Planning Commission approve use permit 18020 based on findings 1 through 6, subject to conditions of approval 1 through 25, and approve the project. This concludes the staff presentation, and I'll be happy to take any comments or questions.
Thank you very much. Do the commissioners have any questions of staff?
Through the chair, just have one question. I noticed that there was a public comment received about the parking, that the person was concerned that it was in a two-car garage and what was required was a single-car garage. I just want to make sure that after speaking with them that they were okay with that.
Yes, they will.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions of staff? No? Okay, thank you. Anybody from the public wishing to speak on this particular item? No? Okay. Open and close. Thank you very much. Pardon me? Oh, yeah. Excuse me. Is the applicant here? Would you mind coming to the podium? Just giving us a brief description of your project.
Good evening, Commissioners. I'm Stephen Randall. I'm the architect for the project. The owners had a previous engagement tonight, so they weren't able to be here. So the existing house had a very nice traditional flavor about it, which we wanted to enhance and keep that character with it. As you know, the addition is occurring on the back of the house, so the front is not changing too much. What we decided to do was just sort of to emphasize that traditional character that the house had. We're going to add some trim to the existing posts that are there, and we're going to add a cornice around it has a porch around the front of it, and we want to add a cornice to that to give it some more detail, and it will also act as a gutter, and that detail will be matched on the rear of the addition, or the rear of the house where the addition occurs. And otherwise we tried to keep it, small scale. They weren't looking to make a really large house. They just want to be comfortable there for a while. And they're currently in a 2-bedroom and 1 bath, and they want to have a, more comfortable 3 to 2.5 bath.
Okay, thank you. Any questions of the applicant's architect? No? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Since I've already opened and closed it to public comment, I'll bring it back to the commission for discussion, entertain a motion. Anything?
Through the chair.
Commissioner Biasotti?
I recommend that we approve use permit 18-002 based on findings of facts 1 through 6 and conditions of approval 1 through 25.
I would second with the amendment that the use permit is 18-020.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Seeing none? Okay, that passes, and there's a 10-day appeal period. Thank you. Okey-doke. Next item, city staff discussion. Is that right, or am I missing one?
Yes.
I did skip one.
Commissioners, on our city staff discussion today, we have a study session on the small cell wireless facilities. It's a staff memo attached to your agenda package. We're holding this study session in response to the comments we got from the commission in June when they reviewed this small cell project at 123 Elm Avenue. At that meeting, commissioners expressed a desire to understand better the regulations and local, state, and federal regarding small cell facility review, and asked staff to schedule a planning commission discussion / study session about the subject. And so this is kind of meant to start that discussion to here today. So with me, Michael Smith, Planning Department staff, and I have Gail Parrish and the city attorney. Gail is outside counsel, and she'll be helping me with the presentation here today. So I'll go first, kind of outlining what our code says today, and also you'll see attached to that staff memo are 2 or 3 other ordinances from nearby communities, and so you can kind of get a sense for what they're doing as well. And in particular, the one from South San Francisco is particularly a small cell, so it's meant to do with exactly the subject matter that we're dealing with here today. Many communities have not developed a wireless ordinance that deals specifically with small cell.
Excuse me one sec. Just so that we're clear, during the study session, we will not be making any type of decision or whatever. It's simply information, if you will.
That is correct. We're looking at our ordinance and having a discussion, and also talking about federal laws and state laws as it relates to this, but we are not approving anything today, nor are we establishing an ordinance, just having a conversation. Though certain addresses will be brought up, they are not being approved here today. Again, it's just a discussion.
Thank you.
All right. So wireless telecommunication facilities are licensed and regulated by the California Public Utilities Commission and the Federal Telecommunications Act of 1996. The city can, with limited discretion, control the time, place, and manner of those installations. San Bruno's wireless telecommunications ordinance was adopted by the City Council in 2006 with amendments in 2009. And those are contained in Chapter 12-220 of the Municipal Code. In recent years, wireless telecommunications service providers have indicated they are experiencing increased customer demand, particularly with respect to data capacity and wireless broadband speed. In order to address this demand, wireless providers are installing small cell antennas placed closer to the users, which are increasingly located in residential neighborhoods. Currently, the department has 8 active applications, and I'm not counting the 123 Elm. That one, for those of you who don't know, was disapproved by the council, or the appeal was upheld by the council, so it was effectively disapproved at the last meeting. But looking forward, we do have 8 more applications from the same actual applicant, but these are the only ones we have in the city right now that are looking to go on infrastructure within the right-of-way. All of the infrastructure is owned by PG&E. None of it is owned by the city at this point. And I'll just read off those addresses for you really quickly. We have 425, and it's also contained in the staff report on the table. We have 425 Cedar, 3400 Crestmore Drive, 1080 Clark, 290 Castleton, 2350 Fleetwood Drive, 350 Amador Drive, 732 Fifth Avenue, and 529 Oak. And again, so these aren't going on those actual properties, they're going on PG&E poles located within very, very close proximity to those properties. So what is a small cell? How do those differ from any other cell installation? Our municipal code does not have a definition for a small cell. So small cells are treated the same way as macro cells, which are the larger ones, which have several antennas and are usually placed higher up and on buildings, and they're in groups. The code, however, does have a definition for a distributed repeater antenna, and that is described as a telecommunications facility that is mounted to an existing vertical structure such as the street light or power pole. So this definition does appear to be a precursor to what we're talking about today, which is a small wireless cell facility. But the federal government also has a definition for a small cell, and so I'm going to read that to you. To be considered a small cell, the structure that it's mounted to has to be 50 feet in height or less. They are mounted to structures no more than 10% taller than other adjacent structures, or do not extend existing structures on which they are located to a height of more than 50 feet by more than 10%, or whichever is greater. The next definition is the antennas are no more than 3 cubic feet in volume. The associated equipment with those antennas is no more than 28 cubic feet in volume. And then there's some legal language, but it says that they do not require structure registration, they're not located on tribal lands, and the facilities do not result in human exposure to radio frequency radiation in excess of the applicable safety standards. So what you saw, what you heard there, and the main components of that are the quantitative ones, which is the 3 cubic feet for the antenna and the 28 cubic feet for the equipment. That's very, very specific. These facilities are also more commonly placed in the right-of-way, and they're placed in the right-of-way in areas that are already usually covered by coverage, but need more. So our Section 12220 of the San Bruno Municipal Code has many requirements for wireless submittals, but it does not distinguish between submittal requirements for wireless facilities and small wireless facilities and macro facilities. As I said earlier, so they're just all treated the same way. One particular thing that is not mentioned in 12220, but we do on practice, and this is instituted approximately 2 years ago, is that when we receive those RF reports, just because they contain a lot of technical information that we don't feel staff is adept at reviewing, we send those out to an outside consultant right now, and so that's not listed as one of our processes, but it is something we do just to ensure that these reports are in compliance with the FCC's RF standards. And just so you know, that process takes anywhere from about 3 to 5 weeks. So in the general criteria in our code is that wireless facilities shall be located in an area zoned either industrial or commercial. If a telecommunications provider wishes to locate facilities in a residentially zoned area, the provider must demonstrate to the city that no other feasible non-residential location is available that would meet the gap in service or other legitimate business need. And that's another thing, they do have to prove to us that there is a gap in service. Where feasible, we recommend co-location, so we know where the other sites are located, the macro sites, and so we do encourage them to go to those locations. We also require that they have a stealth design. And stealth design is defined as improvements or treatments added to or incorporated within telecommunications facilities, including scale, architectural integration, colors, finish, and landscaping that mask or blend the proposed facility into the existing structure or visual backdrop in such a manner as to render it minimally visible and as unobtrusive as possible. And wherever we also encourage, for the most part, building-mounted facilities. And then, of course, we have findings for approval, but those are pretty much the only aesthetic guidelines that we have to go to, and so you can kind of see that they're not objective necessarily, and they're somewhat subjective. State law constrains the ability of cities to legally deny the installation of small wireless facilities in the right-of-way. Federal law prohibits cities from denying a wireless facility application if it complies with the FCC guideline standards for RF emissions. So that's kind of taken out of our hands. Once we send it off, if our outside consultant says that it complies with FCC guidelines, it's deemed to meet the FCC guidelines. So that leaves aesthetics as our primary avenue for regulation of small wireless facilities. Next, federal law also imposes application timeline reviews for wireless facilities. We call these a shot clock. Right now, currently it's 90 or 150 days from the filing date. 90 days generally applies to equipment upgrades, and 150 days generally applies to brand new facilities. And right now, those shot clocks do not differentiate between small wireless facilities, but they are changing. So, and the FCC's just passed a small cell order in September of 2018, and this would generally take effect in January of 2019. And it provided broad preemption for small cell wireless facilities as a new regulatory classification. It reduced application fees, and it created shorter shot clock review requirements for municipalities. So basically, we have more to do, but in a lot less time. Those shorter time frames, we have a 60-day or a 90-day or 150 days. The 60 days applies to small cell wireless facilities, which is what we're talking about right now. So that means that if this goes into effect, we'll have 3 months to review small cell facilities as they come in. And keep in mind that, we do an outside peer review of these reports, and so that already takes a month of that time. The 60 days also applies to co-location facilities. For 90 days, we have small cell facilities on new structures and also some co-locations that aren't covered by the 60 days. And then for 150 days, we have brand new freestanding towers. The other thing that order did was batched applications. So we may not prohibit batched applications. So what that means is that an applicant can come in with several applications at one time, drop them on the department, and we have to still have to respond within these time frames. So moving forward, there's a couple things we need to consider. We need to treat small cell wireless facilities as a separate class, subject to specialized regulations, and so that's what we need to kind of get out ahead of if this is going to happen in January. We should keep our existing regulations because they are good for those facilities that generally don't fall under the small wireless facility classification. 3, we need to look at making more objective aesthetic standards. So we can take a look at our existing standards and make them more objective. We need to streamline the process as much as we can, and that includes any agreements that we are trying to reach with the applicant if they're trying to locate on city-owned facilities. And then lastly, we need to take a look at our fee schedule, because as I said, the FCC, what they just passed, will have effects on how much we can charge applicants when they come in with small cell facilities for review. So, coming into this meeting, we got a question from Commissioner Mason, and so I just wanted to share, because I thought it was pertinent to the discussion today, so I wanted to share that response with all of you. The question was, where are the current cell towers and facilities, where are they located in the city right now? The ones that are on city-owned infrastructure, and what revenue is being generated, and is that standard for these types of installations? So the city has numerous cell towers on city-owned property. One is on water tank number 4 on San Bruno Avenue. We have 2 facilities at Lions Park Field, 2 facilities at 555 El Camino, which is the fire station, another at 140 Arbor, and another at Euclid and Huntington. These lease agreements were entered for these facilities sometime in the 90s to the mid-2000s, and the rents vary, but average slightly over about $3,000 per month. And the leases include an annual CPI adjustment. And the leases are viewed periodically by outside counsel to make sure that they're comparable to what other cities are charging for their facilities as well. So this really concludes my portion of the presentation. I do, at the end, have some slides to show, which are on the other side of the room, and those will show you some of the facilities from other communities, and you can kind of just get a look at how they are going about trying to aesthetically treat these to make them conform to the character of these neighborhoods.
Right. Thank you, Michael. That was a real good report there. Appreciate it. I guess now we will have
Sorry, the
outside counsel.
Yeah, thank you.
Right, so,
I'm sorry, do you want to wait for questions after, or?
Yeah, we're going to wait for questions after we get a report from, I do believe, the outside counsel. Is that correct?
Yes, because it's all part of one presentation.
Oh, okay.
She's going to cover more of the legal side of it, and
Okay.
so then that may answer some of the legal questions you guys have, so then we'll know at the end, once you've heard everything, what questions you may have.
Cool.
So if I could just make a couple of introductory comments. First of all, it's important to note that we are not here to discuss either the application at 123 Elm, nor are we here to discuss the other applications that other carriers have submitted. So this is a study session. Those items are not on the agenda, and we don't want to invite anybody to be talking about those. But what we are here to do is to hear from our outside counsel, Gail Karish. Gail has been with the city for almost a decade. She's our primary counsel that advises the city's cable enterprise, and we have also used her for a variety of technology-related legal issues, including but not limited to leases on our city-owned property, the cell towers on those properties that Michael indicated previously, and then now specifically on the small cell situation. And so she has had a lot of experience with a lot of the cities here up and down the peninsula, and frankly throughout California, having to do with these types of installations, and has really a wealth of knowledge and background about what is possible to do and what it is not possible to do. So she's going to provide a brief presentation about those topics. I do want to let everybody know that Ms. Karish has a plane to catch tonight. She's flying back to Los Angeles, and she's got a hard stop at about 8:30. So if we could try to wrap it up in about 45 minutes, that would be fantastic. So I'll turn it over to Gail.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you, and good evening. I'm going to go through, and it'll be a little bit of repetition from what Michael already covered, but I'll go quickly and just hit the highlights of some of the constraints that you have. As a general rule, of course, cities have, very broad authority to regulate development within their jurisdiction, within the city. But in the case of telecommunications in particular, it's a pretty complex area legally because there's been a lot of activity both at the federal and at the state level in terms of laws being passed, and the Federal Communications Commission and the California Public Utilities Commission all are involved in one way or another in the regulation of telecommunications. I'm going to talk specifically, or more specifically, about wireless, and especially focused on wireless in the public right-of-way where the small cells are typically being deployed these days, and we'll go through pretty quickly a whole bunch of different laws and issues that are there. I'm happy to take more questions. I know this is like a lot to take in very quickly, but it's an overview. So I have a PowerPoint. I don't know if it's going to be up or if you have copies, but
before you start, let me see if we can get a clicker for the PowerPoint so you can operate it, or is Michael going to? Michael's going to do it. All right.
okay. So the first slide, these are all just words, no pictures, so not all that interesting, but I'm going to go through first the federal laws that preempt or in some ways constrain local authority over these decisions, and then some of the state laws, and then I'll talk briefly about the order that Michael alluded to, the latest FCC order that is specifically dealing with small cell facilities, which has not come into effect yet, but is anticipated to come into effect in mid-January of next year. Okay, so federal laws. The first federal laws really that have an impact on local authority here were adopted in 1996. It was the last time that that Congress did a really big kind of rewrite of the Communications Act and everything else. And so there are two basic provisions that we always talk about. Section 253, which deals with telecommunication services, and 332C7, which deals with wireless. And the intent of the provisions is to limit local authority in certain aspects, to prevent local or state authorities from adopting laws or making decisions that might have an effect, might be an effective prohibition, somehow effectively prohibit the provision of telecommunication services or personal wireless services. It's in Section 332C7 that you find the limitation that you cannot consider RF emissions if the applicant is meeting the standards set by the FCC for RF emissions with their facilities. That's where you see that requirement that denials must be in writing, and that they also have language in 332 that deals with the local government must act within a reasonable period of time. And that interpretation of that statute is where we get those shot clocks that we talk about later, the FCC interpreting, well, what is a presumptively reasonable period of time. So those two statutes were adopted in 1996, and then there was no activity on the federal level in terms of actually passing new laws until 2012, and that's when the statute that we usually call Section 6409 was adopted, and that was the one that dealt with certain types of facility requests that they call eligible facilities requests, which are supposed to be minor modifications to existing facilities, would have to be approved. So they completely, if they fall within the box of being an eligible facilities request, local government getting that application must approve it. And so those are the three main federal laws. And then as I mentioned, and Michael talked about as well, the FCC has interpreted some of those laws to establish some shot clocks for action, which are presumptively reasonable period of time for a city to act on an application. And if the two that were established under Section 332, those ones, if you miss your deadline, the remedy for an applicant would be to go to court. There's no deemed grant. But what's unique about the most recent shot clock that was adopted after 2012, under Section 6409, is that one, when the FCC did an order interpreting that law and establishing the shot clock and all of that, they included a deemed granted remedy. So there is a remedy under federal law if you miss that shot clock. Under 332, there's no federal remedy except to go to court. Oh, I see a typo. Okay. So that's a very brief overview of federal law. Turning to state law, and because we're talking about installations in the public right-of-way, the first thing to note is that there is no local franchising authority for any kind of telecommunications or wireless. So if carrier, there is a state statute that allows telephone companies to place facilities in the public right-of-way, without getting a franchise from a local government. But that same state law doesn't give complete authority to the telephone company to just do whatever they like. And so the limitation on their authority to place facilities is that the facilities shall not incommode the public use. And that is where you have a role as a regulator of what kind of installations might incommode the public use. And that has been interpreted in case law to date to include not only thinking about safety issues and things like that, but also aesthetic concerns. And there is a case pending before the California Supreme Court on whether that is an appropriate interpretation of that Section 7901, whether it should include a discretionary review and consideration of aesthetics. So that has for many years been assumed that it would include it, but there is a pending challenge that will be decided in the coming months or years, hopefully months. So that's your basic situation in terms of placing facilities in the public right-of-way. There are also some additional state laws that deal more broadly with zoning authority and some prohibitions on some things that local governments might want to do. So, for example, you can't have a permit that is for less than 10 years unless you can prove up some sort of public safety or land use reason for having a permit of less than 10 years for a wireless facility. That's one of the requirements of state law. And then probably one of the most important ones is a law that was enacted in 2015, that's AB 57, and that law took those federal shot clocks that I said there were 2 federal shot clocks that did not have a deemed granted remedy under federal law, and they created under state law a deemed granted remedy for those 2 shot clocks. So the way that works is if a city were to miss a deadline under the presumptively reasonable time for action, then a carrier could send a letter and say, oh, you've missed the deadline under the federal statute and the federal time, so we invoke our right to say that our application has been deemed granted. And the response that a local government has, they have to make a decision within 30 days whether they will go to court and challenge the invocation of that deemed granted remedy. So that's where federal and state law kind of work together. And then there was, you may have heard in the press, it was kind of a big deal last year, SB 649. It was a small cell bill that was made its way through the state legislature, and that was to further limit local authority over small cell facilities, both regulatory authority and would have required cities and counties to make the infrastructure that they owned in the public right-of-way available for small cell deployments at a regulated rate. And that bill made its way through both houses but was vetoed by the governor. And so what we have now with the FCC's order that I'm going to talk about briefly is sort of the industry response to where the industry went to, probably got about 20 states where they got a small cell bill passed within the state, went to the FCC. There had been proceedings going on for a couple years looking at, the FCC was looking for ways to spur broadband deployment and more wireless deployment, and so this small cell order comes out of those proceedings and tries to achieve a lot of the things that small cell bill, SB 649, would have achieved, but using a different legal path because they have different legal authority. So I'm just going to go very quickly through some of the elements of that order. One of the things that they've done is they've sort of reinterpreted what's an effective prohibition. I talked about those 1996 laws that had that effective prohibition. They've sort of reinterpreted and lowered the standard for what would qualify as an effective prohibition. They've also kind of taken a view that just anything that you'd have in the public right-of-way, any action the city might take about facilities in the public right-of-way or access to the public right-of-way is all regulatory in a sense, so you don't really have those proprietary regulatory distinctions where, you know, you could say no to using my street light pole potentially, but you can't really say no to access to the right-of-way because that has different rules and they have a franchise, so they've kind of blurred those distinctions. And then they've created some other tests for what are reasonable fees to charge, what are reasonable aesthetic standards, and things like that. And then they've created a new little world for small cells, which they have a definition. Michael talked about it. It's also in my presentation. For those applications that qualify as a small cell, they would get the expedited shot clocks and some other remedies and things like that. So that's just the definition of the small cell that Michael was reading. So if you fall within that box now of a small cell, then you get those shot clocks. I mentioned the redefinition of effective prohibition. This is just a little bit more information about it. I don't know if you're familiar with where you hear sometimes about the test in the Ninth Circuit was if there was a significant gap in service and what is the least intrusive means of filling the gap. This is really a replacement for that. The FCC is looking at a different sort of standard now where they're really talking about materially limiting or inhibiting the ability of a competitor to compete in a fair and balanced regulatory environment. It's an impairment kind of standard. As to fees, they've established some rules about fees, saying that fees have to be reasonable, a reasonable approximation of the costs. Only objectively reasonable costs are factored into those fees. Fees no higher than the fees charged for similarly situated competitors. And then they established what they said would be presumptively reasonable fees, that you wouldn't have to kind of prove up that's what your costs are. And so they're very similar to the kinds of things that we saw in small cell legislation that was being adopted at the state level. They've come up with them at the federal level as well. And what they've done most clearly is tried to say that you really don't have, you can't set a market-based rate now for use of your facilities within the public right-of-way. That's where they've kind of taken this very different interpretation of the law that had been on the books since 1996. As for aesthetics, again, they said aesthetics requirements would not be preempted under their new view of what's an effective prohibition if the aesthetic requirements are reasonable, no more burdensome than those applied to other types of infrastructure, and they're objective and published in advance. And so that's another one of those kind of requirements where it's important to, if you want to establish aesthetics, get them on the books. Spacing requirements is another example where they made some comments about that minimum spacing requirements between facilities wouldn't necessarily be illegal, but they could if they would have the effect of materially inhibiting wireless service. So that's another example of what they're trying to do in this order, which is over 100 pages, so a lot to digest. And then, of course, the shot clocks that we had talked about before. One of the things that is a little bit of a variation that will affect all applications, all shot clocks, is that they talk about having it apply to all the permits required for deployment, not just your zoning permit or your wireless permit. So that's a change from a prior, or a clarification of their prior rules. And then with the small, they've done another thing that's a little bit different, and that's sort of really inside baseball here, but with those other shot clocks that they established a few years ago, that or in 2009, that were 90-day and 150-day, you had 30 days to, you could stop the shot clock as a local government if you send out a notice of incompleteness within the first 30 days. And that would stop the clock until the applicant responded, and then when they responded, you had 10 days to respond again if you wanted to stop the shot clock. They've done something a little different with these small cell shot clocks, which are very short. And that is, when the first application comes in, if it's incomplete, if it's materially incomplete, and you respond within 10 days, then it restarts the clock complete, like it just stops, and it starts at 0 when they resubmit. Like you go back to day 1, as opposed to the others where if you had 30 days and you took 28, then when they resubmitted, you'd be at day 29. So this one, when they resubmit, it would be at day 1 again. So that's a little innovation. So the last page of my presentation is just trying to put all these different time frames together. Once the order takes effect, you'll have a lot of different shot clocks going on, and then shot clocks within shot clocks to manage, so it will be a bit of a planning nightmare, but that's how the new rules have shaken out. So that's the end of my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. That is a lot to take in. In one short swoop. Okay, now's the time to ask any questions, commissioners.
Through the chair.
Go ahead.
Just to clarify, those new regulations that you just went over, do they provide any, do they make any changes to the technical requirements regarding radio frequency maximums, or is the standard that they refer to from the FCC the same it was before?
So the FCC, so their rules continue to just, they've made no change in terms of your authority to consider, the environmental effects of RF emissions. The applicant would have to meet whatever the FCC standards are. They have separate proceedings going on that they actually started in 2013, trying to update some of their RF emission standards, but that is one issue that I think is an issue that they're going to have to deal with at some point, but they don't deal with it in these orders at all.
So as far as we're concerned, when we get those reports from the third-party consultant, they're still looking for the same target numbers for
Yeah,
the
they have not
installation.
updated their standards at all, yeah.
And in terms of fees, I'm not sure I heard right. I got the impression from this that the fees that the city could charge for reviewing these applications was in fact more limited under these new rules.
So what they've done is they've said it has to be cost-based, it has to be reasonable costs, and then they've given what you would think of like a safe harbor. Like if you charge this amount, then you don't really have to prove up that that's what your costs are. We'll just say that seems reasonable and that could very well be your cost. But if you were actually going to charge more, then you would potentially have to do some sort of cost study or something to justify and show that those are your real costs.
And is there any sense of whether those costs are comparable to what the cities have incurred in the past for reviews?
Well, a lot of states, and California is one, where you, for the services that the city provides, right, the service of, reviewing permits and stuff, you're already obligated under state law to only charge your costs. You can't make a profit off of that. Where it has a bigger impact, a bigger immediate impact is when you're dealing with like the rental rate that might be charged for using a city streetlight, where it was a market rate, you could negotiate what you could get, and this attempts to change that. Although they say it doesn't require, they say in the order they're not requiring you to allow access. If you don't allow access, then or you can't agree to a rate, then you potentially have a claim, an applicant potentially has a claim that you are effectively prohibiting them from providing service because you will not make your infrastructure that they want to use available at the rate that they would like to pay.
So in other words, reasonableness is defined primarily from the point of view of the applicant.
Yeah.
Okay, just checking.
Any other questions?
Through the chair.
Commissioner Mason?
So I have a couple of questions. As far as the limitation to the time, place, and manner that's described on page 1, and this is, I see that it's limited to installation. So as far as time, I know that one of the concerns that came up from the public was this buzzing noise that apparently may come from these facilities. So would that be considered a time limitation, because the buzzing would be a 24-hour buzzing that's 365 days a year?
So that would be, turned it off too quick. So that would, it's not uncommon for cities to have like some sort of noise ordinance or some kind of noise requirement, and that would be part of you don't really have to categorize it as time, place, or manner. It's sort of, that's part of would it incommode the public? If you think of the language in the statute, so incommoding the public can have all sorts of ways you can be incommoded, I guess, if you want to use that word, right? It can be aesthetically, this doesn't look pleasing, it doesn't go with the aesthetic of the neighborhood, it's making noise, it's generating heat, it's obstructing a view, people can't cross the sidewalk here, those sorts of things.
Okay. Regarding, it's on page 2 of 7, on the very top sentence says, in order to address this demand, wireless providers are installing. And then page 2 of 7 goes on to say, these small wireless facilities are not intended to replace macro wireless sites, but to fill in areas that do not have sufficient capacity. So my question, I guess, is, and I don't know if this is to staff or to our council or to the applicant, but what's the demand? I think the first time that these came to us, we were told that the demand was this 5G. And then as I heard this kind of evolve into an appeal, and then I went to the city council meeting, then I heard that the demand was that there was gap, and I think someone asked the question, how many of your calls are being cut? So what is the demand? What is it that is trying to be addressed? And I don't know that can be answered because that is specific to the applicant, but I think I do want to know is, what I would like to know is, what are the boundaries in asking that question?
So I think, so that's an interesting question because this is where the law is kind of evolving, at least with this FCC order. The current Ninth Circuit test, when you would think about, well, why would you even have to show, demand or something like that? Usually people think of it as, because if they're trying to show that a denial would be an effective prohibition, then there's that, you're showing a significant gap in service and least intrusive means of filling the gap. So the significant gap in service is where they're showing what the demand is. But now the FCC is, in this more recent order, is kind of moving away from that standard and saying that that's not appropriate in this environment. And I think I have something on that in one of the slides, one of their quotes. Yeah. So they say, for example, in the one that is redefinition of effective prohibition, they say prior approaches erred by requiring coverage gaps. So basically they're saying, this significant gap, these intrusive alternatives sort of thing appears like they're trying to abandon that. And I think that goes with the fact that now, when in 1996, when these laws were adopted and the case law that sort of developed, what does that test mean? They were really looking at like actual gaps in coverage, right? That you need another macro site to cover. There were just areas where you'd have like dead spots and things like that. Now the wireless industry is at a point where it sort of covers everywhere, and they're really dealing more with capacity issues. And so this is the FCC's response, is just try to take that issue off the table. But when you're reviewing an application, you really have to start with, well, what does your code require? And if your code is requiring to show something, maybe, show a need or something like that, then you do that evaluation. And it may be that a carrier might say now, you can't legally ask those sorts of questions, things like that. But the test, historically, the one that the courts developed was carrier by carrier. They would look at their own network and whether they had gaps in their own service.
Okay, so you don't necessarily need to consider that a company wants business growth versus
Right.
there's an actual gap in coverage. Like there's an actual separation between those two.
Right. Yeah. And another element that's a little different with the installations going in the public right-of-way is the argument that some of the applicants make is that, well, we have a franchise right to, as a telephone company, to use the public right-of-way, and we don't have to show need. We just have a right to use it. And the case law isn't entirely clear on that, but that's one of the points of contention that comes up sometimes in this.
That was actually going to be another question of mine is, can you show need in the application? Can we make that? I think one of the questions was if we wanted to update the San Bruno code, can that be a suggestion
Right.
that we would require the need as part of the application by the applicant?
Yeah, and so that is one where it sometimes it appears in codes in various formulations, and those are arguments that you hear from applicants when they're faced with those kind of requirements. Sometimes is that they say, well, if I'm in the public right of way, I don't have to show need, and so there isn't like clear case law on that.
Okay.
It's one of the points of contention with if you think of this as all sort of moving to putting wireless facilities in places where, these laws are old and not really, they didn't contemplate that. So we're all on sort of new territory here, figuring out what the final rules will be and how it will all work out. It's going to take, I think several years and various court cases and things to get some clarity on some of these issues.
Okay. For still on page 2 of 7, there is a comment that's in the quotation is effective radius of 300 feet. So small wireless technology has a maximum effective radius of 300 feet and therefore requires the sites to be much closer together than the larger macro wireless sites. Is the 300 feet allowed per company? And if that's so, is it possible to have one wireless facility that might have one box from Verizon, one box for AT&T, one box for T-Mobile, because they can all argue that there's a gap in coverage in that radius?
Well, I'm not sure where the 300 feet came from, because I think it's hard to generalize. It really depends, and we have we have experts here that are the carriers that can talk about this maybe a little bit if they choose to speak on these points. But the difference between macro cell and a small cell is just the coverage area. But doesn't always mean you're using completely different equipment or that you couldn't cover a bigger area. It's sort of how you power the antenna. And so 300 feet might be a limitation with certain types of wireless facilities that are using certain types of spectrum, but it wouldn't necessarily, it's not different equipment and different spectrum. It could be much bigger than that. So that number, it's not, I don't know what, I'm not sure where it came from. Actually, I didn't work on the report, so, but I know that it could be a variety of.
I think that to narrow my question, it's really more of what's the limitation for one location. So if I'm at a house and I am already concerned about having this outside of my home because it's an eyesore, right? This one particular small cell facility. But Verizon, and I'm just saying Verizon because that's the company here, but Verizon's not the only player, right? And
right.
So let's say now AT&T comes and they say, this is actually a great location for us too, and we also have a gap in coverage. Can we then say, oh, you know what, we've got to respect that these people live here and that now they're going to have 2 ugly boxes in front of their house? I mean, at what point do we have some authority to say there's a limitation per pole or per right-of-way?
Well, there's not clear answers on that. There's a little bit in what the FCC's been saying in their latest order, and that's on one of the slides too. We talked about spacing requirements. I think it's slide 12. So what the FCC has been saying, because that is something that you sometimes see in some of the ordinances now where they say, well, we're going to say they have to be every 1,000 feet right. or something like that. So I put on slide 12 what the FCC has said about that, and they've said that it could be a problem, right, if it has the effect of materially inhibiting wireless service. So that's sort of their new standard, a replacement for a significant gap, least intrusive means is this kind of material inhibition, which is like, there's not an obvious answer to that, right? Because it's sort of going to depend on topography and the carrier and what they're trying to do and things like that. So it would be hard to know, in one city you might have 1,000 feet and that's just fine. In another city, if you had 1,000 feet, that would materially inhibit somehow because it's hilly or something like that. So it's hard to give a firm answer on how it might play out. It's very kind of fact intensive.
Okay. And I have more questions, but I can let some of my commissioners ask some questions.
Just to jump, if I may, through the chair. Kind of jumping in onto what you were saying is, if we couldn't say right into our code distance requirements, spacing requirements, because of the inhibiting issue, could we, however, say that it wouldn't meet our aesthetic guidelines if we had a bunch of boxes on one pole? Would we have that kind of leverage?
Yeah, I mean, and you could even have the spacing. I mean, this isn't saying you couldn't
right.
have it. It's just it's hard to know if it would materially inhibit or not, right?
Correct, but that aside.
But it certainly, I think the area where if you look at aesthetics and what the FCC's order is saying about it, is certainly recognizing that you can have aesthetic standards, and there have to be objective, I'm trying to find the page, it have to be objective, whatever that means for aesthetics, I'm not sure. They have to be reasonable, and they have to be published in advance.
I see.
So that's all the guidance they've given, and I should mention that this is, this order is controversial, and there will be appeals, and we'll have to see where we end up. But unless there is a stay, it will go into effect in January.
If I may, also related to this point, in the staff memorandum that was on the city website, I read some discussion of the case you mentioned on one of your slides, T-Mobile versus San Francisco, and the fact that using aesthetics now may become more difficult as well. What I understood was that there was a possibility that not only do you have to are you trying to consider aesthetics as a planning commission and as a city, but we might now be faced with some creep from, if you already have installations that are comparable, if you have eyesores already, then you can't prevent more of them to be installed, which would be exactly the case that Commissioner Mason is describing. You let one small cell facility be installed here on this pole, and therefore we might be prevented from invoking aesthetics for adding more boxes. Is that correct? Did I understand that correctly?
Well, it's hard to know in a general way, right? Because cities change. There's nothing wrong with changing your standards, right? I mean, you may find something is acceptable when it's there's a minimum amount, but then you reach a threshold where now it's become real clutter, right? So it's hard. Well, I think one of the things I find the most difficult in trying to understand what the FCC's trying to accomplish here is what is an objective aesthetic standard, because that's an interesting concept to me. But I mean, these are the sorts of things that there's not a clear answer, and it's going to, what usually happens is communities take different approaches. Some are more conservative, some are more, take a bigger challenge, or kind of read things differently, and eventually we get to answer through the courts. But I do want to mention that T-Mobile and City of San Francisco case, the city was successful at the Court of Appeal, so they upheld that you can consider aesthetics, and the appeal has gone to the California Supreme Court, but it's the company that appealed.
I had a question about, I saw in the report that was provided to us, the City of Monterey said, I guess they voted no. San Mateo denied these. In Millbrae it's pending, and Burlingame pending, but the original was a no as well. Hillsborough is currently in court, it appears, and Mill Valley recently had a unanimous no, and they actually changed their zoning, I believe, one of their ordinances. So it appears that cities, at least across the Bay, are finding that they do not want these in their communities. And how do you feel that the law is, I guess, supporting these decisions that they're making?
Well, a lot of them, I know our firm is involved in some of those, and so I know that some of the denials did end up in litigation. And I think what that list doesn't tell you is like where they said yes, right? Because there have been a fair number of small cell deployments already made in a lot of cities, but that you don't hear about those as much. I know that the city of San Francisco, for example, has a lot of small cell facilities deployed, and there are in other places too. So it's hard to know from just a few anecdotal examples of some denials, sort of how many have been deployed and where and what cities are doing. But the ones that are on the list, I'm not sure how they were selected or why they were highlighted, but
I know you're gonna have to go in a minute, so I'm trying to get the more legal questions out. I think as far as the cities that have taken the cell tower facilities, are there any legal restrictions to getting community benefits, or for the cities receiving, or do you know of cities receiving community benefits in exchange for the cell towers, or the cell facilities, or, anything that we've really discussed in that arena?
So, if you're just talking about regulatory approvals, there is not a lot of leverage to ask for community benefits through a regulatory approval. Where we've seen some deals done where there's been some community benefit of some sort is more where they were the applicants wanted to use the city infrastructure, and so instead of just paying rent, they may pay partly rent and partly in-kind benefits. You saw that in Verizon has done a few of those, like in Sacramento and Los Angeles and San Jose. I think it was Verizon and AT&T. So there are a few examples of that where they've looked at not only installing the facility, get on city infrastructure, paying some portion rent, giving some other sort of in-kind benefit, whether it's we're going to test out some new applications for data collection, traffic management, something like that, or whether it's deploying in different parts of the community or those sorts of things. But it's getting increasingly hard to seek that because of these additional rules that are being imposed.
Excuse me. I know that you have to catch a plane, you have to be out of here at 8:30, and it's 8:30. So, are there any more questions, or, because she definitely has to go. I don't know if we have any more time, or if you have any more time, actually.
I think the meeting can continue
We
now.
probably have five minutes or
Okay,
so before.
5 minutes more questions, and she has to leave, okay? If anybody has any more questions.
Yeah, I don't, is the meeting ending when you leave, or are we continuing with the meeting after?
I think you still have some,
Yeah, we still have a
Yeah,
few more
okay.
things.
yeah, and some people will want to speak from the public, potentially,
Okay.
yeah.
So the other issue that came up at both the public meeting and our meetings was about underground. The underground, so is that something that can be required as opposed to being above ground on these poles?
So the antennas to work have to be above ground, and so we were really talking about the additional equipment that goes along with the antennas.
Mm-hmm.
And there are, the FCC talks a little bit about that in its order, really in the same way that they talk about aesthetics. So it includes undergrounding, it has to be reasonable, no more burdensome than anyone else, objective, that kind of thing. But as a general rule, you always are looking at whether the undergrounding is going to be feasible. And sometimes it's just not feasible because there's no space in that particular area, or the terrain isn't suitable, or things like that. I would think of it like any other aesthetic issue, where it makes sense and it can be done. There's no reason why you couldn't require it, but there may be technical or other reasons why you couldn't. It wouldn't work in a particular location.
I have recommendations on I think the staff asked for recommendations on some of these codes, but if anyone else has questions, go ahead.
Anybody else?
The chair.
Commissioner?
I just want to clarify that this is not the actual study session. This is a primer for the study session?
Yes. So the goal tonight was to provide the commission with information and a large part of the legal framework. And I think, kind of in summary, a lot of what we've heard tonight from Gail is that both state and federal law provides the cities, not just San Bruno, with very little room to regulate small cells. And there's pending rules out from the FCC that will further curtail that. And so we really wanted to communicate that information to you tonight, have Gail available for questions. But this discussion at our next meeting will really morph into what are our options vis-a-vis the areas of regulations that we do have, largely aesthetics and a few other things. But tonight was really to ask and answer most of your legal questions. I guess the only other summary comment that I would make is this is a sphere that we are just one player in, and we can control very little, and that's true from the regulatory framework, but that's also true for just how the industry is set up. It's carrier by carrier. You know, this is really different than, let's say, electricity, whereas now there's one infrastructure in the Bay Area that's made by PG&E, but you can buy your energy from PG&E or you can buy your energy from a clean energy provider, but they're not adding new wires and new lines overhead. But the way this industry is set up, there's not one ombudsman wireless provider that all the carriers use. And so the regulations manipulate that, whereas they allow and provide specific ability to carrier by carrier. And so that's unfortunately one where we find ourselves, and I think some interesting comments were brought up with regard to co-location. And we should get into those discussions because that's it can go both ways. You know, one person can look at it and saying, well, if our regulations incentivize or try and find some way to incentivize co-location, we have fewer things on fewer poles, potentially. But also co-location has the other opposite effect that you mentioned today, which is wherever that pole is, if it's in a residential neighborhood, that is potentially multiple carriers' equipment on that one pole. And so we need to talk about and grapple with those things within the very kind of limited framework we have.
Great. Thank you. So, hope that answered all those questions. I think at this point in time, well, I know, Gail, you two got to catch a plane, so that's going to end that part of the session. I guess our next thing would really be, if we're still online with this, is carriers are going to have 5 minutes each to make a presentation. Are we still going through with that part of this? Yeah? Okay. Which carriers are they, by the way? Okay. Please step up there and...
Paul Albritton, outside counsel for Verizon Wireless, and I hope not to be 5 minutes. We don't have a formal presentation.
Thank you.
I want to begin really by thanking you and thanking the staff. The staff in particular, Michael and Gail and Mark, have been particularly professional throughout the entire process that Verizon Wireless has been involved with your staff. The staff reports are extremely professional. I was very impressed with the staff reports that were presented tonight and at the City Council, and I mean that sincerely. And we're very thankful to you for taking the time to go through extremely complicated issues of federal and state law, of how, and trying, I think, to begin to understand some of the challenges, of course, that you're up against, but that we're up against as well in trying to provide this very important service, which is intrusive to the aesthetics of the community in ways that, we prefer that it were magic and that people's phones would just work. But for the 30-plus years that I've been working on this, it's been extremely difficult to locate wireless facilities in a manner that can provide service to local communities, whether it was the original towers that we proposed, or now down to these small cells where we're trying to provide this, what has become this ubiquitous service. I've harkened back to, I say when I started this business, we thought we'd have 2% market penetration of people with cell phones. And as you know now, there are more cell phones than there are people. And so it's this demand that you're hearing about is The average home now has 13 connected devices of things that people carry and use. 52% of households don't have a wireline phone anymore. They've got wireless phones. And it's not just phones, as you know. It's iPads, it's watches, and then it's also cars. It's the computers inside cars talking to the mechanical repairman. It's the ambulances reporting back to the hospital. It's the UPS guy who signs your name and that you've gotten your package and tracks your package. It's fish, when they come off the ocean, are placed with a monitor that monitors the temperature from when they come out of the ocean all the way to market. There's a wireless monitor that determines that confirms that the temperature is accurate. There's agricultural monitors on wireless networks that are monitoring the moisture in the water, the weather, and so forth in order to provide sufficient water to crops. So it's just ubiquitous wireless services that we are experiencing today that is driving this demand that's nearly doubling the amount of data that is required to feed this ever increasing and economic engine that's being created. Good night, Gail. And that's the demand that we're facing. And we went to the city council and we showed the city council, we didn't present it to you, the data that we use, that Verizon Wireless has used. There are 5 factors to determine this increased demand, where the demand is, and how we're trying to fill that capacity. You may have bars on your phone and signal, but not capacity to continue a call reliably, or for data to transfer in a manner that's reliable as well. And so that's the purpose for these small cells and why the small cells are going into the residences. Our data is showing that the residential use is a lot of where the demand is, and we have to offload some of that residential data demand by small cells in order to keep the entire network working, whether it's El Camino or Highway 101. It's an integrated network. So that's what we're trying to face. You were talking about the distance. I want to answer, if I can, quickly some of the questions. How far does a small cell travel? Well, they're small cells and they're small cells, and I'll blend it with where we've been successful. There are over 100 poles in San Jose. We have over 400 poles in San Francisco, over 100 in the East Bay, over 100 in Palo Alto, amongst various carriers. Verizon Wireless just got 11 approved. We have small cell networks going up everywhere. What you're reading about are where Verizon's run into difficulty potentially. Verizon hasn't given up on any community, though. Any of those communities you look at where there have been potentially setbacks or pushbacks on design and so forth, Verizon Wireless is still planning on having small cell networks in those areas, and we're moving forward. And we're planning having a small cell network in San Bruno. We want to work with you as closely as we can. There's a question about co-location, and I just want to say that maybe you guys know how many utility poles and light standards there are in San Bruno, but there's so many that a carrier can frequently go to the next pole down the street without having to co-locate. In addition, there are very tight controls over what we can put on a pole from PG&E in terms of structural ability, wind load, and spacing, so linemen can climb the pole. So rarely do you co-locate 2 carriers on one pole, and that's because of those 2 factors that I just described. There were a lot of other questions, and we'd be happy to answer any other questions that you might have. I've already answered. Oh, benefits. I'll just leave off with benefits. The obvious benefit of having a robust wireless network is the impact it can have on the residents and their ability to communicate in times of crisis, the use by your emergency services personnel, but all the way up to tracking that FedEx package. Some cities like Los Angeles, San Diego, Sacramento have been coming to Verizon Wireless to expedite the 5G network so that they can become more economically involved and generate economic activity and also keep the quality of life going forward in their communities. And those are the real benefits that we see. And in those cities, we have one example. I see this light flashing, so I'll finish up. In Newport Beach, for example, the police department was having a real trouble communicating during the 4th of July celebrations when they had a huge influx of people. We identified where small cells would solve this problem, priority communication zones, and Verizon Wireless is in the process of building this priority communication zone for the police, as well as putting a fiber connection to their police stations so that they're able to communicate. This network certainly benefits Verizon because our network works better, people can talk, and they can communicate through the Verizon network, but at the same time, we're partnering with the police department there to provide services to this community. And Verizon works with many public safety agencies in providing service, and that's one of the huge benefits. I spoke quickly. I'd be happy to answer any questions. I know it's you guys work hard, and I know they pay you a lot to sit there. and I'd be happy
You
to
have
answer
no
any
idea
questions
how
as you go.
Yeah, I'm sure that we must have some questions.
Through the chair. I actually just have, I just left out one question, and then I have two questions for staff. But is there an additional advantage to the fact that San Bruno is adjacent to SFO?
No, sorry. I've been in negotiations with San Francisco Airport for decades, literally. It's kind of interesting. This San Francisco Airport does have service, but at one time when I was negotiating with John Martin, the airport manager, we figured out that the city of Yountville and the airport had about the same demand. It's hard to believe, but so there is demand at the airport, but it's kind of short-lived. The airport is served by facilities at the airport, so Verizon Wireless has a facility in the parking lot of the airport, and then there's also a DAS network in the baggage area that provides services, and there are also some PG&E towers that directly serve the airport, and so the airport is, in addition to the DAS network and those other facilities built at the airport is covered, so it's not, and it's actually, we are trying to provide service to the residents of San Bruno. The facilities, like the Elm Avenue facility, have a very small radius that they serve, and that's intended to cover those residents, and at the same time, offload it. We have 5 cell towers in San Bruno. It's to offload the overall network. We have what I call an umbrella of coverage from the macro cells that are providing service. It's giving signal strength to everybody, but it's not necessarily serving the capacity needs of in certain residential zones, and the small cells provide that capacity. It's not a word, I guess, an underlayment of service to the macro service. So the small cell in San Bruno will have no impact on no direct impact on San Francisco Airport. It will provide some relief to the SFO, the sectors of the SFO. We call it the SFO sector facility that is facing San Bruno, but that's a benefits San Bruno because that's the sector of that facility that faces San Bruno. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions?
Again, thank you for taking the time to learn these, and we'll always make ourselves available for any of these kinds of forums.
Great,
to
thank you.
participate. Thank you.
Through the chair, can I just ask staff a quick question before we wrap this one up? Two quick questions. One for staff is in regards to comments regarding the codes. So should we wait for that for the next session for suggestions? Because you gave us the comparisons, and I liked some of what I saw in some of the other cities.
Yes, that would be preferred. It would give you time to think about it and think about what you've heard here tonight, and then at our next meeting we can dive a little bit more into actually trying to look at a code solution to this.
Okay, and then my second question is in regards to page 4 of 7. I was a little concerned that I saw that the city's consultant, when I looked on their website, they also represent the cell phone companies as part of their clients, and I just want to make sure that they're not, whoever it is that's representing the city of San Bruno is solely representing the city of San Bruno.
Sorry, can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, I was concerned when I saw, so I should go back to kind of historically, that I believe I recognized somebody at one of our meetings that I then saw again at another meeting. And at one meeting, the person was representing the city of San Bruno, and at the other meeting, they were representing an applicant, and it was the same person. And so when I looked up this particular consulting group, I did notice that they represent both the cell companies and cities. So I just want to ask staff, if you don't have to answer this now, but if we can ensure that whoever is consulting for the city of San Bruno is solely representing the city of San Bruno's interests.
That is correct. We have had a few incidences, very few, where the applicants, the carriers, have reached out directly to our consultant to prepare their RF reports, and we've had conversations with our consultant that we can't have that.
Yeah,
They
thank
work
you.
specifically for us, yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Okay. At this time, besides the banging that's going on in here, is there any members of the public who wish to comment on any of this that we briefly discussed? Okay, so what I need for you to do, if you would, Do we have speaker slips by chance? What I'd like to do is, for those, I don't know how many are going to want to speak, but I do need to know how many are going to speak. Pardon me? Oh, I could do that. How about with the raise your hand? I didn't think about that the old-fashioned way. Two of us. All right, I like old school. That works just fine, okay? Don't worry about getting the cards. We only have 2, so we're good. You will be limited to 3 minutes on your comments, please. So, who's ever ready, please go to the podium and state your name, and we'd love to hear your comments.
I'm one of the appellants, and we were very pleased to have the City Council vote in our favor in regards to this issue, because we represent a very small neighborhood, and we have an anchor pole, what we call an anchor pole, going into this neighborhood. And we've studied numerous city councils. Some of them were mentioned here earlier, and how these cities have responded to the number of cell towers and antennas that were going into their cities. And we did a study on ours based on a 4-block area, based on the Verizon specifications that were brought forward during the original Planning Commission. And we discovered that of the one anchor pole, there's a 300-foot radius that was discussed of coverage, and that approximately every 200 feet there would be another antenna or another pole or whatever the configuration is that they plan to use. And this really disturbed us. And so as we went into reviewing this, we found out that Monterey was another example. They had done an independent study of the towers that they wanted to put in Monterey City, and found out that there was an exorbitant number of towers and antenna combinations that exceeded 9,000 in an 8 square mile area. And we've really counted on all of these different cities and their city council meetings and their planning commission meetings and all the information that they've given out. And we came to the conclusion after seeing a video that was put out by Verizon, where instead of trying to inhibit progress, we could proceed with the progress with cell towers. Verizon has a video that says how they can place these towers anywhere from 1,500 to 3,000 feet outside our small neighborhoods. And that's where we prefer it to be. That's where even Governor Brown, when he vetoed SB 649, he didn't want these towers in the small communities, in amongst all of our trees, amongst our neighborhoods, and taking up unnecessary space. And that's why we came here. We want it to be done in the most effective manner, and we would prefer that you postpone, because of all these variables, postpone as long as you can until all of the studies have been concluded that these are safe and for our neighborhoods, that there are no hazards, safety hazards involved, that we know we can't discuss health hazards, but we want to make sure that whatever is done, it's done properly, and we don't want these hanging over our heads at 5 stories high in the air or 30 feet off our bedroom windows. We're very worried about the aesthetics, and we're worried about each other, the whole community. But if you start off with one tower and end up with 9 to 10 in a 4-block area, that's a concern. And so that's what brought this all about. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Next.
Good evening, Planning Commission. My name's Simon Mazzola. I appreciate your efforts on our behalf. I have a few comments. One of the things that I noted in the staff report was that it seemed to be talking along the same lines as the carrier's position of increasing demand, therefore we need more cell sites. I know that there's a limited amount of things that you can do, but I do want to encourage you to not be pushed into unnecessarily allowing permits for cell sites that you don't have to the extent that that is something you agree with. some of the language in the staff report sounds very pro-cell site, and obviously I'm not in favor of that, and I would encourage you to be a little bit skeptical. I noted one of the comments was that a cell site has an effective radius of 300 feet, and there was a question from one of the commissioners about that. In the Verizon application, I think that they put that at 500 feet. But one of the things I would ask you to look at is what's the overlay of these? I realize there are limited grounds of what you can do, but I don't know that there's been enough attention devoted to if one cell site has this RF footprint, which is presumably allowable, what happens when you put another one 500 feet away? What happens if you put 3? Does that exceed the limit? So I don't know the answer to that, but let me just ask you to please consider what's the overlay of these things. Do those exceed the maximum RF allowances? I have a feeling they do, but I'm not a scientist. So I would just ask you to look into that. I would encourage the city to revamp its laws to make them as strong as they can be, to give the guidance that's necessary for aesthetics. I would also encourage you to consider a larger footprint of notice to our citizens. I understand that the rules are when there's a permit that notice goes out to 300 feet of people. I know that's a funky way of saying it. I don't think that's nearly sufficient for something that's a citywide concern. When we're talking about a major impact on our city by cell companies or other utilities coming in and wanting to do major things, I think that this notice requirement has to have a different standard. It's one thing if I'm fixing my house and you're my neighbor, you might not like that. But this is a different situation altogether. So I would encourage you to look into revamping the notice requirement so that the whole city gets notice when something is going to affect the whole city. I thank you for your time. I appreciate your consideration. And hopefully we can work together on this and come up with some good rules. Thank you.
Thank you. Do appreciate your comments. Very thoughtful. And seeing as how there was no other hands that were raised and no other carriers to give us any type of presentations, I'm going to bring this now back to commissioners to discuss the information with staff and amongst ourselves, knowing that no decision is going to be made tonight, and it's ultimately going to get referred back to staff. So I don't know really what we have, if there's anything more to add to what we've already, discussed tonight so far. October 30th sounds like a more viable date, but if you guys have something you wish to discuss.
Yes, we can come back at a subsequent meeting, most likely November. I can't remember what the November date is, but that would be probably the earliest we would try to come back and revisit this issue.
Yeah, I don't know how I got the October date in my head. I don't know. But that would be fine. Is that all right with everybody here? Or do you guys have any burning desire to ask a particular question that needs to be answered?
Through the chair. I wanted to start by thanking staff for including South San Francisco and Rancho Palos Verdes code in our staff report. I found it really helpful and gave me a little bit of insight into what other cities are doing and what they are expecting of their applicants and how they are trying to define aesthetics a little bit. Just to clarify, South San Francisco does not have, their code is not specific to small cell installations? Or it is?
Yes.
It is, okay.
So the whole title of that ordinance is the small cell ordinance.
And same with Rancho Palos Verdes, because that was significantly more detailed than South San Francisco, I found.
The Ranchos Palos Verdes, I believe, might be an overall cellular ordinance as opposed to specifically a small cell ordinance.
Okay, so maybe it included both.
Yeah.
Okay.
Most communities haven't developed a small cell ordinance yet, so they are very, very hard to find in California. And Ranchos Palos Verdes, they do have a very robust system for how they regulate these. In fact, if you go to their website, you'll see that they can tell you where a mapping of every single one in the city.
Yeah.
So I included that because I thought it would be helpful, because just that, it is more detailed.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that, and I think it showed a great breadth in seeing both. And just a couple points, I don't want to hold us here for too long, but I thought this might be beneficial for you to know my interests before the next time we come back together. I had heard mentioned, I can't recall where it was, I have 5 pages of notes because the reading was so fun in the last 4 days, every little word in this report. So I was wondering how feasible it might be for the city to hire a third-party wireless expert that might be able to give us more information, not necessarily from a carrier, not necessarily from staff, not necessarily from website searches, but an actual third-party expert who could lay out for us different aesthetic options, how different places are doing it, what are the clever things that we can look for so that as we're building our code, we can keep these thoughts in mind and integrate them in as we see fit for our community. Additionally, I'd like, and this may tie in with the third party, a larger understanding of the total cumulative small cell sites that we project will be proposed, especially in residential areas, but throughout the entire city. And maybe that would involve mapping, maybe it would involve understanding what they're doing in other cities that have been further developed with small cell sites. But I think that we're talking about spacing, we're talking about mapping. I am really interested in that, because if it's every telephone pole in San Bruno, that's one thing, and it's a different thing if it's spread a little bit more delicately through our neighborhoods. I need some sort of context for what we're looking at as far as location and the quantity.
If I may, I can try to touch on that right now.
Please, I would like that.
2 weeks ago, I did attend a cellular presentation in Redwood City, and that was by another outside consultant, none of which have been to our meetings. And he conservatively estimated that each carrier would need a small cell facility, approximately 4 per every square mile. And so and this is just his opinion, based upon what he sees. So he saw a significant proliferation of these facilities within the coming years, within the next decade.
Within the next decade?
Yeah.
In which time maybe 6G will come along and surprise us.
Yes, and he said that this was not even to accommodate 6G, or 5G, excuse me, but just to accommodate the exponential growth of personal handheld device usage, especially in the house.
Yeah, absolutely. No, there's no denying that there's demand. And I wanted to know if City Council was going to be invited to participate in the study session when it does happen, or if they've showed any interest or have...
Sure. Why don't I take that?
Yeah.
So we're here tonight because the City Council expressly directed staff to begin a process with the Planning Commission to look at revising the city's small cell regulations. And I think they use the word expeditiously because the longer we take, the more applications we may receive, and every application we receive abides by the rules that are in place when we receive that application. And as you heard tonight, there are the shot clock issue that may actually get shorter in January with the new FCC regulations. So time is a little bit of the essence. And so the goal was for us to have a process with the Planning Commission and then take that information to the City Council for a final decision. And so the City Council will not participate in the discussions we have here, but the Planning Commission will hopefully make a recommendation that we carry to the City Council. And we can certainly look into getting an outside expert. One of the challenges is that people are positioned on this issue, and finding someone that's truly independent may be hard, but we can certainly look for that information for someone that could provide additional information.
Yeah, thank you. I'd appreciate that. I think I just had a couple more questions. I visited the National League of Cities website, and they have some good information that seems pretty up to date in light of the new changes of the not FCC, the FCC. And they also talked a little bit about different cities that had done a really good job partnering with carriers to create infrastructure that works aesthetically and for the carriers, including Lincoln, Nebraska, and Tempe, Arizona. They actually worked with carriers to create a standard pole that met the needs of about 95% of the city's pole locations and could accommodate most carriers' equipment. Maybe this is getting too detailed, maybe we save this for next time, but I know that we're in the middle of revamping our streetlights, if I'm not mistaken, and didn't know if that is something that might overlay. This might be where the third-party fellow comes in, but I just wanted to throw that out there in light of knowing that we're doing streetlight modifications. And that's all I have for tonight. Thank you.
Okay. Commissioner
Mr.
Giussani?
Chair, this gentleman brought up a really good point. Because of the nature of the type of issue we're talking about, I don't know what the process would be to look at wider notification than 300 feet. Do we need to talk to City Council, or is that something we can discuss?
So you can include whatever notification requirement you think is reasonable in the ordinance as a recommendation. So the idea would be, I think, as we're considering here.
No, I'm sorry, Mark. I meant moving forward, like on these hearings, going up to creating an ordinance.
Sorry, I misunderstood.
How do we go about spreading the word a little bit more to folks?
So we did not, correct me if I'm wrong, we're not talking about a specific application, so there was no 300 or 500-foot radius notice that this meeting was noticed at. I think if you're asking if we can broadcast the fact that we will be having a November meeting widely across the city, across different platforms, we can certainly do that.
Thank you. That would be appreciated.
Great.
Through
Any
the-
other questions?
Through the chair, I just actually wanted to thank staff. I thought the memo and then the having Gail Karish from Best and Krieger here was really helpful. And so I know I can be a little tough sometimes, and I sent some emails to Michael kind of at all hours of the morning. So thank you so much for responding. I really appreciate the responses. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? No? Okay. You know what? I'm going to call this preemptive study session closed, for lack of a better term, I guess. Now we're going to bring it back to staff discussion. I guess we need to select the November 15th, if that date's correct, for the ARC review.
Yes, we are looking for 3 members for the November 15th, 2018 Architectural Review Committee. Do we have any volunteers?
I will volunteer.
Thank you. Commissioner Lethem?
I can volunteer too.
Commissioner Lagasse, thank you.
I'd like to nominate Kevin one last time.
I respectfully decline.
Looking for one more?
Write me down, but I may be going out of town. That's the
Okay.
only thing, but go ahead and write me down. Thank you.
Michael, I'll be
Mason.
standby if you need.
Great, thank you, Commissioners.
And planning commission discussion. Boy, I should wear my glasses. Anything else? Otherwise,
No?
Well, at this
Okay.
time, I think we want to acknowledge Commissioner Chair Chase on your years of service. You started the commission in 2001, I believe, in October of 2001. So it's been 17 years. We definitely appreciated having you up here. Your lightheartedness has been great. It adds a bit of levity to the meetings, and you're a great guy, and you'll be missed.
well, thank you. I guess so real quickly, I need to just thank staff. 17 years went by real quick, and, there's been a lot of changeover in staff, but one thing that's really been consistent is the fact that we've always had really good lead planners. Michael, you're no exception to that. We've had, it's been great. It's made our job, at least for me, it's made my job doing this much easier with the reports that we've gotten over the years, and they just continue to get better as they do now. So, thank you, and everybody in the past who's worked on that, including our city attorney and David, and I can go back to, I forget who the first community development director was, retired and he moved down to Palm Springs. Pretty outgoing individual. Anyway, he was an interesting chap. But beyond that, my fellow commissioners here, you guys are in great hands. You've got 3 new commissioners here who ask all the questions that I wish I could ask that I probably asked maybe 15 years ago, or even a little bit, after that. But they're on the ball, they're energetic, they've got the city's best interest in mind. I mean, it's great. Rick, he's just solid as a rock. I mean, this guy's, he's fantastic, and he's helped me out a bunch, as have, my other commissioners here. Mary Lou, too bad she's not here, I'm gonna miss her dearly, but, and, it's really been an honor and a privilege to serve, on this commission, and, I take it, a little levity every now and then, with the gavel and what have you, but, it truly has been an honor, so, thank you, I appreciate it.
And before I forget, and before we get in, I just wanted to acknowledge the certificate of public recognition that we have here for you, Commissioner Chase, and I'll bring that up to the dais.
Thank you. Very kind. Thank you. Can I close it now?
You served for the entire millennium.
Wow. That is really nice. Thank you very much. Man, oh man, I guess I'll call this meeting adjourned. Have a great night. Thank you.
So, now that you're no longer a planning commission.